You've been drinking fake cider. What I'm about to reveal will shock you, save you from wasting money on overpriced apple juice, and expose the 15 brands that are lying to your face about what's actually in that bottle. These are truths I've uncovered after years of studying cider labels and industry loopholes. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never grab a cider from the shop the same way again. Let's start with the cider that's been on British bar taps since 1981. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Blackthorn Dry contains less than 40% actual apple juice from concentrate, with the rest made up of water, glucose syrup, and what they vaguely describe as natural flavouring to create that supposedly dry character. The 5.0% ABV comes from fermenting a concentrated apple base that's been shipped from multiple countries, including China and Eastern Europe, then processed in Britain using rapid industrial methods. What makes this particularly dodgy is the name itself claiming to be dry when they add glucose syrup and sweeteners during production, creating a drink that's far sweeter than traditional dry ciders from Somerset or Herefordshire would ever be. They also use sulfur dioxide as a preservative and forced carbonation to create that fizzy character, rather than allowing natural fermentation to develop genuine sparkle over months of aging. The brand was created by Gamer Cider Company and has changed ownership multiple times, each transition bringing further recipe modifications and quality reductions while maintaining the traditional imagery on the label. At £3 to £4 per pint in pubs, you're paying for a name that suggests authenticity and British heritage, but getting international concentrate processed through industrial equipment with chemical additives. Here's the Swedish import that convinced British drinkers this is what cider should taste like. Kopparberg contains approximately 8 to 10% fruit juice, with the majority being water, sugar, and natural flavourings that are technically derived from fruit but heavily processed. The 4.0% ABV doesn't come from traditional cider fermentation, but rather from fermenting glucose and apple concentrate base, creating what's essentially an alcopop masquerading as cider. What's particularly misleading is how they market it as a sophisticated, fruity drink, with images of pristine Swedish landscapes, when the reality is industrial-scale production using minimal actual fruit. They add citric acid as a preservative and acidity regulator, along with carbon dioxide forced into the liquid rather than naturally occurring from fermentation. The result is that sweet, fizzy drink that British youngsters started drinking in the 2000s, thinking they were having proper cider. Traditional British cider makers use 100% pressed apple juice, naturally fermented with wild yeasts or carefully selected strains, creating drinks with genuine depth and character. What you're getting with Kopparberg is closer to a flavoured malt beverage than authentic cider, yet pubs charge premium prices of £5 to £6 per bottle because the branding suggests quality that simply isn't there in the ingredients. Right, here's the Irish cider that transformed British drinking habits in the 2000s with that ice-filled pint glass campaign. Magners contains concentrated apple juice that's primarily sourced from China and Poland, then reconstituted with water in Ireland, meaning those 17 Irish apples in every bottle are actually international concentrate mixed with Irish water. The 4.5% ABV comes from fermenting this reconstituted juice with added glucose syrup to boost alcohol levels and reduce production time from months to mere weeks. What makes this particularly cynical is how they convinced British drinkers that serving cider over ice was traditional Irish practice, when it was actually just a marketing gimmick invented in 2003 to differentiate their brand. The ice serves a purpose though, diluting the sweetness and masking the lack of complexity that proper cider would have from using fresh-pressed British apples. They also add sulfur dioxide as a preservative, extending shelf life but adding chemical compounds that cause reactions in some people, and certainly have no place in traditional cider making. During their advertising boom, Magners positioned themselves as premium and authentic, charging £5 to £6 per pint in pubs, but you're essentially paying for concentrate from Asia, mixed with Irish water and clever marketing. Traditional Irish cider makers in County Armagh and Tipperary use locally grown apples and natural fermentation, creating ciders with genuine character that reflect their terroir, not international supply chains and industrial processing. Now here's the twist that most British drinkers don't know. Bulmers is actually the exact same product as Magners, just sold under different names in different markets because C&C Group owns both brands and the Bulmers name was already established in Britain. The recipe is identical, using concentrated apple juice from China and Eastern Europe, reconstituted with water and fermented with added glucose syrup to achieve 4.5% ABV in about 3 weeks, rather than the traditional 3 to 6 months. What's particularly offensive is how British drinkers have been convinced these are two different products with their own heritage and character, when you're literally drinking the same industrial cider with different labelling. The company's original Bulmers heritage dates back to 1887 in Herefordshire, when H.P. Bulmer created proper cider using local apples and traditional methods. But that authenticity ended when Irish distillers took over and industrialised production. They add the same sulphur dioxide preservatives and use the same concentrate suppliers. Yet the British market still treats Bulmers as a heritage brand worth premium pricing. Traditional Herefordshire cider makers who actually use local apples and proper fermentation methods produce ciders with infinitely more character and authenticity. At £4 to £5 per pint, you're not paying for quality ingredients or traditional methods, you're paying for marketing campaigns and brand recognition that have nothing to do with what's actually in your glass. Here's the New Zealand cider brand that appeared in British pubs around 2014, and the reality behind those Kiwi mountains on the label. Old Mout contains approximately 30% fruit juice, but the apple concentrate primarily comes from China and Turkey, not New Zealand, with the various fruit flavours added through a combination of juice concentrates and natural flavouring compounds. The 4.0% ABV is achieved through fermenting this mixed base of apple concentrate, glucose syrup and water, creating that distinctively sweet, juice-like character that's nothing like traditional dry cider. What makes this particularly misleading is the heavy marketing around New Zealand's pure environment and quality fruit, when the actual ingredients are sourced globally and processed industrially. They add malic acid to enhance tartness and create artificial complexity, plus sulphur dioxide as a preservative, extending shelf life to over a year when proper cider should be consumed much fresher. The brand is owned by Heineken, making it a corporate product rather than the independent Kiwi craft cider the packaging implies. Traditional New Zealand cider makers in Hawke's Bay and Nelson use locally grown apples and minimal intervention methods, creating ciders that genuinely reflect their origin. What British drinkers are paying £5 to £6 per bottle for in pubs is international concentrate with New Zealand branding, targeted at the same market segment that drinks flavoured ciders, and the premium pricing goes towards sponsoring music festivals and marketing campaigns rather than quality ingredients or authentic production methods. Brilliant bit of Scandinavian marketing here, but the reality is quite different. Rekorderlig contains less than 15% fruit juice, with the majority being water, sugar, and fruit flavouring preparations that are heavily processed extracts rather than real fruit. The 4.0% ABV comes from fermenting apple concentrate, imported from multiple countries, mixed with glucose syrup to boost fermentation speed and alcohol levels. What's particularly concerning is how they've positioned this as a premium Swedish cider, with sophisticated flavours like wild berries and passion fruit, when you're essentially drinking an alcopop that's closer to a soft drink than traditional cider. They add citric acid, malic acid, and various preservatives including potassium sorbate, extending shelf life but adding chemical compounds that genuine cider makers would never use. The elegant bottle design and Swedish branding convince British drinkers to pay £5 to £6 per bottle in pubs, but the ingredients list reads more like a chemistry experiment than a beverage with thousands of years of tradition. Traditional Swedish cider makers exist, but are virtually unknown in Britain because mass-market brands dominate shelf space through corporate distribution deals. What you're drinking is industrial-scale production using minimal fruit juice and maximum marketing budget. targeted specifically at British consumers who've been taught to expect cider to be sweet, fizzy, and fruit-flavoured rather than dry, complex, and apple-focused, like it traditionally should be. If this is making you rethink what's in your glass, do us a favour and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this list. Ever drunk any of these thinking they were proper cider? Comment below. Now let's crack on with number 9, and this one's going to shock you. Here's the Somerset cider that many British drinkers assume is the real deal because of the traditional branding. Thatchers Gold contains approximately 50% apple concentrate mixed with 50% fresh pressed juice, which sounds better than some on this list, but still means half your cider comes from imported concentrate rather than Somerset orchards. The 4.8% ABV is achieved through controlled fermentation, using commercial yeast strains selected for consistency rather than character, and they add glucose syrup to boost alcohol levels and speed up production. What makes this particularly disappointing is that Thatchers is actually a family business with genuine Somerset heritage dating back to 1904. But like many traditional producers, they've had to compromise quality to compete with mass-market brands on price. They use sulfur dioxide as a preservative and add carbon dioxide for carbonation, rather than allowing natural sparkle from bottle conditioning, which traditional farmhouse cider would have. The gold colour isn't entirely natural either, enhanced with caramel colouring to ensure consistency across batches. Small-scale Somerset cider makers like Burrow Hill and Hex use 100% fresh-pressed local apples and traditional methods, including wild yeast fermentation, creating ciders with genuine terroir and complexity that Thatchers Gold simply can't match, despite their authentic origins. Here's the Danish brand that appeared in British supermarkets around 2012, and the production method is absolutely scandalous. Somersby contains approximately 40% apple juice from concentrate, with the rest being water, glucose syrup, and what they call fermented malt base, meaning it's partially brewed like beer rather than fermented like traditional cider. The 4.5% ABV comes from fermenting this mixed base of apple concentrate and malted barley, creating something that's neither proper cider nor proper beer, but a hybrid designed purely for cost-effectiveness and mass production. What's particularly offensive to cider tradition is how they've marketed this using Danish apple orchard imagery and suggestions of Scandinavian quality, when the reality is industrial production, by Carlsberg using the same cost-cutting methods they apply to their lager brands. They add citric acid, malic acid, and preservatives including potassium sorbate, plus artificial sweeteners in some variants to reduce sugar content while maintaining sweetness. The fact that major UK supermarkets stock this prominently, often at £1 to £1.50 per can, shows how price-driven the market has become, rather than quality-focused. Now here's the cider that positioned itself as the craft alternative when it launched in the late 1990s. Brothers Festival Cherry contains approximately 60% apple juice, which sounds promising until you realise it's primarily from concentrate sourced internationally rather than fresh-pressed Somerset apples, with cherry flavouring added through a combination of juice concentrate and natural flavouring compounds. The 4.0% ABV comes from fermenting this mixed base with commercial yeast strains, and they add glucose syrup to boost fermentation efficiency. What makes this particularly misleading is how Brothers marketed themselves as small batch and craft-focused during their growth phase, using traditional imagery and Somerset heritage in their branding. But after being acquired by Molson Coors in 2016, production scaled up significantly with inevitable quality compromises. They use sulfur dioxide as a preservative, citric acid for tartness, and forced carbonation rather than natural sparkle, creating that characteristic fizzy sweetness that the British market expects, but traditional cider makers would reject. The festival range expanded to multiple fruit flavours, each using similar concentrates and flavouring approaches rather than real fruit added during fermentation. At £4 to £5 per bottle in pubs, you're paying for craft branding and Somerset Association, but getting corporate production methods and international ingredients. Here's the Irish cider that launched in 2015, targeting British millennials with edgy branding. Orchard Thieves contains less than 35% apple juice from concentrate, with the majority being water, glucose syrup, and what they vaguely term natural flavouring on the ingredients list. The 4.5% ABV is achieved through rapid fermentation of this concentrate base, taking just 2 to 3 weeks compared to the months traditional cider requires, and they add commercial yeast strains selected for speed and consistency rather than flavour development. What's particularly cynical is the name itself suggesting apple orchards and craft production, when the reality is industrial-scale manufacturing by Heineken, using the same methods and supply chains as their other cider brands. They add citric acid, malic acid, and sulfur dioxide, plus use forced carbonation to create that fizzy character. The Easy Apple tagline and marketing around sessions down the pub successfully positioned this as the go-to for younger British drinkers, charging £4 to £5 per pint when production costs are minimal due to concentrate usage and rapid turnaround. Traditional Irish cider makers in Armagh's Orchard County used locally grown apples, including heritage varieties like Michelin and Dabinet, naturally fermenting with wild yeasts and aging for months to develop complex flavours. What Orchard Thieves offers is convenient branding and demographic targeting, rather than any connection to actual orchards or traditional methods. Yet it's become enormously popular because British drinkers have been conditioned to expect cider to be sweet, easy drinking and fizzy rather than dry, complex and craft produced. Right, here's AB InBev's attempt at cider, launched in 2012 to capture the growing cider market. Stella Cidre contains approximately 50% apple juice from concentrate sourced from multiple countries, including China and Poland, mixed with water and glucose syrup to create the fermentation base. The 4.5% ABV is achieved through industrial fermentation, taking just 10 to 14 days. Using the same rapid production methods InBev applies to their lager brands, resulting in that characteristically bland, uncomplicated flavour profile. What makes this particularly offensive is how they've used the Stella brand name with its supposed Belgian premium heritage, applying it to a product that has nothing to do with Belgian cider tradition, which barely exists anyway, because Belgium is famous for lambic beers, not cider. They add sulfur dioxide as a preservative, citric acid for tartness, and use forced carbonation to create artificial sparkle, rather than natural fermentation creating genuine effervescence. The fancy packaging and premium positioning convince British pubgoers to pay £5 to £6 per pint, but you're drinking international concentrate processed through industrial brewing equipment with brewery efficiency rather than cider-making craft. Traditional cider production in Britain, France and Spain involves single variety apples or carefully balanced blends, natural fermentation taking months, and minimal intervention to allow the fruit's character to shine through. Here's the Suffolk cider that trades heavily on traditional imagery, despite modern compromises. Inches contains approximately 65% apple juice, which sounds promising until you discover it's a blend of concentrate and fresh pressed juice, rather than 100% fresh Suffolk apples, as the marketing implies. The 4.2% ABV comes from fermentation using commercial yeast strains, and they add glucose syrup to boost alcohol content and reduce production time from traditional 6-month aging to just 4 to 6 weeks. What makes this particularly disappointing is that Suffolk has genuine cider-making heritage, with orchards growing traditional varieties. But even regional brands have succumbed to using concentrate to remain competitive on price. They use sulfur dioxide as a preservative, add carbon dioxide for carbonation rather than allowing natural sparkle, and use fining agents to create that crystal clear appearance that traditional farmhouse cider would never have, because natural cider is slightly hazy from suspended apple particles. The rustic branding with countryside imagery and traditional fonts convinces British drinkers they're supporting local production. But the supply chain includes international concentrate mixed with local juice. At £3 to £4 per pint, it's cheaper than premium brands, but still represents compromised quality compared to what Suffolk cider could be if made traditionally. Now here's the Suffolk cider house dating back to 1728, and the compromise of tradition for modern markets. Aspall Premier Cru contains apple juice from concentrate mixed with fresh pressed juice, with the exact ratio undisclosed, but industry insiders suggest it's approximately 50-50, meaning half your supposedly premium cider comes from imported concentrate. The 7.0% ABV is higher than most ciders, achieved through extended fermentation and added glucose syrup to boost alcohol levels, creating that distinctively strong, slightly harsh character. What's particularly troubling is how Aspall has genuine historical credibility and traditional orchards in Suffolk, but like Thatchers, they've had to adapt their production methods to compete in the modern market while maintaining premium pricing. They use the méthode champenoise term on their labels, suggesting champagne-style production with bottle fermentation, but the reality is they add sugar and yeast to create secondary fermentation after the initial fermentation of concentrate-based juice. The Premier Cru designation has no legal meaning in British cider production, unlike French wine regulations. So it's purely marketing language, suggesting quality that the ingredients don't fully support. Small farmhouse cider makers across Suffolk and neighbouring counties produce single variety ciders using 100% fresh pressed apples and wild yeast fermentation, creating drinks with genuine complexity and terroir that Aspall's volume production methods simply cannot match, despite their historical credentials and family ownership. Here's Britain's best-selling cider since the 1960s, and the uncomfortable truth about what millions drink every week. Strongbow Original contains less than 30% apple juice from concentrate, with the majority being water, glucose syrup, and what they term flavourings, which are heavily processed compounds designed to create apple-like character without significant apple content. The 5.0% ABV is achieved through rapid fermentation of this concentrate base, taking just 2 to 3 weeks, using commercial yeast strains selected purely for efficiency and consistency. What makes this particularly scandalous is how Strongbow has shaped British expectations of what cider should be, convincing generations that this sweet, fizzy, pale yellow drink represents proper cider, when traditional British cider is dry, still, or lightly sparkling, and made from 100% fresh pressed apples. They add sulfur dioxide as a preservative, citric acid and malic acid for tartness, and use forced carbonation to create that characteristic fizz. The production facilities in Herefordshire and Wales process millions of litres annually using industrial equipment and global supply chains that have nothing to do with traditional cider making. During the 1990s and 2000s, Strongbow's marketing budget dwarfed the entire turnover of traditional cider makers, establishing market dominance through advertising rather than quality. At £3 to £4 per pint in pubs, it's relatively cheap, but you're drinking what's essentially an alcopop made from concentrate with minimal connection to actual apples. Right, here's the ultimate insult to British cider drinkers and traditional cider makers everywhere. Strongbow dark fruit contains less than 25% actual apple juice, with the rest made up of water, glucose syrup, and artificial fruit flavouring that's supposed to replicate blackberries and cherries, but contains virtually none of the actual fruit. The 4.0% ABV comes from fermenting a concentrated apple base that's been shipped from overseas, then diluted and flavoured in Britain. What makes this particularly dodgy is the addition of sodium saccharin as a sweetener, giving it that syrupy taste that masks the lack of real fruit character. Traditional fruit ciders use actual British berries added during fermentation, creating natural flavours and colours, but Strongbow needs chemical assistance and food colouring to achieve that distinctive dark red appearance. The brand's been around since 1960, but the recipe's been reformulated countless times, always reducing quality while maintaining those £4 to £5 pints you're paying at the bar. Real cider makers in Herefordshire and Somerset would never dream of using artificial flavours, but when you're owned by Heineken and producing millions of litres annually, authenticity takes a backseat to profit margins. Well, there you have it. 15 ciders that aren't quite what they claim to be, from concentrate masquerading as proper cider to artificial flavours replacing real fruit. Next time you're at the pub, maybe consider a proper farmhouse cider from an independent producer, or at least know what you're actually paying for. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and click on the next video on your screen. Cheers!